Hi, I'm Ems, aka on Dark and Wings. I got some of the paint2.0 speed paints. This is my first time using any of the speed paints, even the original ones, so I'm quite excited. If you don't already know, I love paints as much as I do war dollies. I own a lot of paint, and I mean a lot of paint, and I'm fortunate to have some companies who've sent me brands out before, and I have some of those reviews on my YouTube channel. I'll put the link in the description below for you. When it came to these speed paints, I thought I would go with some skin tones, as I thought these would be great to try out when batch painting armies or small teams where you want a bit more diversity in the skin tones to make them more interesting to look at. I have these corn berserkers here to test it out on. I always think it's a good idea to have some spare models to test new paints on and practice and get better at painting techniques. You could pick up some cheap second-hand models, or you could get some 3D printed. As you can see here, I've started using one of these fidget popper things. I gave into the hype and they're actually really awesome to use for inks and washes, etc. I'm going to put the paints on as they are. I'm not going to add any water or any additives. I've just shaken the pot up. So starting off here with the warrior skin. So first of all, I like the consistency of these paints. They block in the coverage really well. And they're not too thick. They're not too gloopy as you might find with some contrast paints from Games Workshop. The warrior skin is very highly pigmented. It covers super well in my opinion. I like how there's some separation in the paint as well, so the darker pigments go into the recesses and you can push them back in and play around with them, so it saves you having to add a wash later on. So far so good. I really like this one, and it's nice to see some darker skin tones in this range as well. Next up is the peachy flesh. This is an orangey fleshy peach tone, obviously. It's a very similar consistency as the first one. I've shaken it up very well. And as the same with the first one, again, you get these darker tones which you can push around and put into the recesses. I think this one looks pretty good, to be honest. It's not as good as the warrior skin, I'd say, but I think it covers nice enough. It might be because it's a paler colour, but I still think it's pretty good. Next up is the noble skin, and this is the one I've been most looking forward to. Arguably, darker skin tones are hardest to get right because of the transitions of colours, and a lot of brands haven't really picked up on doing darker skin tones until more recent years. I was really hoping this paint wouldn't just be like any other black paint out of a pot and would actually have something different to it, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that it was actually like a black skin tone. I was really hoping this paint wouldn't just be like any other black paint out of a pot and would actually have something different to it, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that it was actually like a black skin tone. As I said at the beginning, my intentions with getting these paints would be to quickly paint up an army and make some diverse looking characters within it to make it more interesting and more believable. This one was super impressive. It definitely looked like a darker skin tone. Lastly, I have the Crusader skin, and this one seems to be the most popular one from the flesh tones, as it always seems to be sold out online. So this one has some more like reddish hues to it, similar to Guilliman Flesh contrast paint. Once again, the consistency is very similar to the other ones, which is nice to see. And again, the paint separates slightly, so you can put the darker tones into the recesses. It's cool to see that this does look different to the peachy one. I'm really happy that all of the paints have been their own unique colour. None of them are too similar to each other, which I think is really nice to see in skin tones. Honestly, it's been a joy to try these out. I'm not sponsored by the Army Painter, by the way. These are just some things I've got, and I think they look awesome. So here I wanted to show you all of the paints once they've dried fully. I think my favourite has been the warrior skin, it has these lovely rich tones to them. The peachy flesh looked nicer once it had dried up. The noble skin was fantastic. It was the biggest surprise out of all of them to actually see darker skin tones being represented like this. And it came out great. And lastly, the Crusader skin. I see why this one is popular. It's got a really rich tone to it, and it's very similar to Guilliman's Flesh Wash. I was surprisingly impressed by these paints. They covered really well even after one coat. For an even better result, let it dry and then put a second coat on, pushing more of the pigment into the recesses. Obviously, these aren't made with high-end painters in mind, these are for people who want to quickly paint armies. I think they look great, but compared to, say, this model where I've spent my time with it and I've added highlights and shadows and some variations of tones with different acrylic paints. That isn't to say you couldn't use speed paints in a more technical way for more high-end painting. This is something I do with contrast paints as well, but I might as well show you for speed paints. So here is something I've painted just with the normal acrylic paint. What I'm doing here is thinning down the speed paints just with water, and you can make them into washes and glazes that way. Because these paints are so highly saturated, you can really push them and keep watering them down if you want to. And you can easily make something look even more visually interesting by washing these over the top of already existing skin tones. I forgot to point out the price of these paints, so they range from about £3.15 to £3.80. And that's a lot cheaper than Games Workshop contrast paints. I personally like using these more than washes. You can also add some more interesting variation and tones if you grab some different colours and wash them down and add them as well. So you could grab a darker tone and put them into the recesses and the deeper parts. A final tip I have when it comes to speed paints and contrast type paints is that you can mix them with other acrylic paints. Because speed paints tend to be more highly pigmented and saturated, you can mix them with other colours and make better tones. Plus they tend to be viscous and have quite a good flow to them, so it makes your paints go onto the models easier. In conclusion, I think the speed paints far exceeded my expectations. I'd like to try out some more of these. I think they're great if you want to just army paint, but you could also use them in more technical ways if you wanted to. As always, thank you for watching. Remember to enjoy your hobbies for yourself, respect that people enjoy them in their own ways, and at the end of the day, they're just war dollies. I'll see you in the next one.